Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I'm Ryan Wormeli, joined by Pat Fitzmaurice and by Derek Brown. Fellas, we're talking fantasy takeaways for the AFC North. Always a very hard-fought division. Ravens came away on top this year, 12-5. They are the third seed in the AFC playoffs. We will start at the top. We'll start with Fitz. What was your fantasy takeaway for the AFC North in 2024?
Worm, this will start with the Ravens, and I'm sorry I have to go negative on your favorite team, but it would make for a boring show if my takeaway for the Ravens was just that Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry are awesome. So I'm going to say Zay Flowers should not be regarded as a top 20 wide receiver for 2025. I think Flowers is terrific, really fun to watch, really talented. He is well worth the first-round pick the Ravens spent on him, but the way the Ravens offense works makes Flowers this inconsistent fantasy performer, and that inconsistency can kind of bite his stakeholders in the butt at times. There were 8 games this season where Flowers had 6 or fewer targets. There were also 8 games in which Flowers had 40 or fewer receiving yards. That's almost half of his games. Under 40 is obviously a day you're not pleased with if you're a fantasy manager. The problem is that the Ravens ran the ball on 52.5% of their offensive snaps this year. Only the Eagles were run heavier than the Ravens were in 2024. And do we really think that's going to change next year with Lamar Jackson at quarterback and Derrick Henry at running back? That's just the MO. It didn't change when Greg Roman left town. And this is just how the Ravens are built. So I have Zay Flowers ranked wide receiver 21. And I'm wondering if even that is a little too high. Quite frankly,
it's too high. Yeah.
You know, I will say on the run, I don't know that the problem for Zay Flowers is how run heavy the Ravens were. I think the problem for Zay Flowers is how run heavy they were at the goal line, because there was just not the opportunity to get touchdowns unless they were coming from very far. He only had 4 touchdowns this whole season. He had 1 in week 2, he had 2 in week 9, and he had 1 in week 11. That was it. And to me, that is like by far the biggest problem. If that number's doubled, just up to not even some crazy number, if that number is 8 to 10 range, then I would be feeling a lot differently about Zay. And even with only 4 touchdowns, he was still wide receiver 22 this season and half PPR scoring. Like, I think watching the games, obviously I watched very closely. I came away from the season feeling like he took a step forward. He is maybe not a fantasy wide receiver 1, or definitely not that, but he is a very valid and capable wide receiver 1 for the Ravens offense in a way that no receiver really ever has kind of fully solidified since like Anquan Boldin. Like, it's been a while, and he does it very differently stylistically. So I really like Zay Flowers, and I think there's a chance that if the touchdowns do start to come, then maybe you are a little bit low, Fitz. But having said that, we've been given no reason to expect those touchdowns to come, because even when they do throw, it goes to Mark Andrews or Isaiah Likely or whoever else. So, D-Bro, I know you were kind of nodding along and seeming to agree with that.
I agree with everything you just laid out there, Worm. That was the points that I was going to make. And it comes down to touchdowns. It's not a matter of talent. He got enough targets last year, and he was efficient enough with them. It comes down all to touchdowns. Zay Flowers, to your point, Worm, you talked about the number of receiving touchdowns. His red zone role is not enough. It's not nearly enough. So, I think he should be, because he was the wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game. So, looking at him as a wide receiver 3 is exactly where I think he should be. He had 2 stretches this season of at least 5 games. 5 games without a single freaking red zone target. You're going to have ebbs and flows of Zay Flowers considering the context of the offense. You're also going to have those touchdowns are not going to be there to stabilize and also raise the ceiling and floor of him on a weekly basis, unless he's just breaking off massive plays downfield, which he could, but that's really tough. And that's a lot to ask any player to do consistently week after week after week if the red zone role is not there. So I love the talent. I love his role in this offense. He is taking a huge step forward, regardless of whatever metric we pull up. But the red zone role, unless that changes, he's not a wide receiver 2. He's a wide receiver 3 for me.
Fitz, I wonder, do you kind of ascribe anything to, his targets fell off a lot in the second half of the year? They didn't, entirely go off a cliff. He was still getting, 6, 7, 8 targets a game. It's not as much as we would have liked to see. It wasn't like he was getting no targets. This is just in general, not specific to the red zone. But to start the season, week 1, 10 targets, week 2, 11 targets, week 5, 12 targets, week 8, 12 targets. Those were all in the first half of the season. Through week 9, he was wide receiver 10. He was ranked right in between Brian Thomas Jr. and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like he was a wide receiver 1 in the first half of the season. And then the second half, it just wasn't there. Did anything change in the second half of the season? Was it just we got to Derrick Henry season and, they wanted to, use him even more? He started scoring fewer touchdowns in the second half of the year. So I don't know if it's that. Is there anything that you would kind of point towards as a reason for that?
It seemed like Lamar was more proactively targeting Rashad Bateman. And remember like how meager the target counts were for Mark Andrews early in the season. Like he got more involved too as the season went on. So I think it was basically greater involvement for those two maybe cost Flowers a few targets.
Yep, absolutely agree. It was Andrews' resurgence. It was Bateman taking a step forward, a deserved step forward in this passing attack.
D-Bro, let's go to your takeaway for the 10-7 Pittsburgh Steelers, the 6th seed in the playoffs. They're going to be going to Baltimore for that fun rivalry matchup in January. But the Steelers 10-7, what's your takeaway?
If Russell Wilson is back as the quarterback and Arthur Smith is back as the play caller for Pittsburgh in 2025, I'm fading this offense. This was one of the most disappointing offenses. Yes, okay, if you had Najee Harris this year where you're like, oh, cool, he's a flex option, but then there's a lot of weeks where you're like, oh, geez, why did I start him? RB 25 in fantasy points per game. Jaylen Warren, RB 39 in fantasy points per game. Both of those guys, I understand that both of those guys were looking towards 2025, are free agents, so maybe neither one of them are back. But the bigger point to how Arthur Smith, we've already seen this, people. Do you remember Bijan Robinson getting his rookie season ruined because of Arthur Smith trying to be the smartest guy in the room and trying to not run? This is just another situation of Arthur Smith not running his offense through his best players on a consistent basis. And this trickles down to George Pickens, wide receiver 35. He had 6 games, only 6 games this year, where he was a wide receiver 2 or better in weekly scoring. He had 8 games where George Pickens was outside the top 40 wide receivers in weekly scoring. So while we hoped more consistency out of George Pickens, because he's the only dude in that passing attack, we didn't get it. You got a revisiting of the previous year of George Pickens. The wrapper changed, the substance was still the same, and Pat Fitzmaurice, because of this offense, because touchdowns go everywhere except the best players, again, Pat Fitzmaurice, weeks 1 through 17, when it actually freaking mattered, tight end 16 in fantasy points per game. Thank you, but no thank you, Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith. You ruined this offense for fantasy for 2024, and if they're back again, they're going to do it again in 2025.
D-Bro, if I told you that we were going to get one of these two back, exactly one, not 0 and not both, what would you rather see? Would you rather see Russ and a new offensive coordinator, or would you rather see Arthur Smith and a different quarterback?
Oh, good Lord. Arthur Smith and a different quarterback? Pittsburgh, if I was Pittsburgh, you keep Justin Fields. Dude, the playbook of how to stop Russell Wilson, it limits so much of your effectiveness and what you can do. It is legit. Play too high, put 2 safeties over the top. You take away the go ball bucket shots on the perimeter. You make him beat you in the middle of the field. And Russell Wilson hasn't seen the middle of the field since maybe high school. So that's not going to happen. It's just so freaking predictable, man. It's so easy on a weekly basis to say, oh, hey, they're playing a single high team. Well, let's go George Pickens. Yay. Bucket shots down the sideline. Oh, it's a too high coverage and he's screwed. Okay, we're not starting anybody from this offense. Maybe the running backs.
Fitz, what do you think?
I kind of agree with half of D-Bro's take and half not. I don't, as of now, want to be too heavily invested in the Steelers offense for 2025, especially if it is the Russ and Arthur Smith show again. I just don't think Russell Wilson is the same guy he was in Seattle. That is kind of gone, and he sort of swerved everyone, I think, when he had some big games right away after taking over for Fields as the starter, but that just wasn't sustainable, especially with a pretty poor group of pass catchers collectively. And going to George Pickens, D-Bro, I just Like, I don't think he's a CeeDee Lamb guy who you can give 150, 160 targets. He's just not that kind of player. I don't think he is a true alpha. I think he's more of like a big play specialist. I mean, I don't think he's mature enough to be a true alpha, quite honestly.
You're right.
Yeah, I don't think either Najee or Jaylen Warren deserve to be, the lead back. I think it was wise to platoon those guys. The only guy I have questions with the usage of would be Pat Freiermuth. And I'm still not totally sure how good he is, but that's just what Arthur Smith does. He wants to use multiple tight ends. So we were, of course, going to get some Darnell Washington and Michael Pruitt, and that was going to be really frustrating. So I don't necessarily blame Arthur Smith for the way he deployed the limited skill position weaponry that he had, but I do agree that this is not looking like a very fruitful source of fantasy goodness for 2025 as it now stands.
Last thought on the Steelers. Fitz, do you expect to be ahead of or below consensus on George Pickens next year?
Below.
Big time below. Yeah, I mean, on a weekly basis, can we rule out George Pickens getting into a fight with any cornerback that's out that decides to cover him and he just doesn't like it and he throws a fit and he's out by the halftime? Nope.
I mean, maybe I'll be in line. I've got him wide receiver 23 right now. And I kind of started with him a little higher, and I just decided that was a little too much, and I wanted to move him behind guys like Zay Flowers. Like, as many issues as I have with Zay Flowers and his usage, I think he's a better bet than George Pickens for 2020.
I would actually much rather have Zay than Pickens.
Same.
Debra, what you would also feel that way?
Pickens will be a wide receiver 3 for me.
I was going to say, when you said wide receiver 23, Fitz, I haven't actually sat down and done 2025 like early rankings or anything yet, but my initial gut reaction to hearing that was that's a little bit too high. It's not like insanely too high, but to me that I don't think I would have him as high as that. I think
real fast, Fitzy. George Pickens or Marvin Harrison Jr. next year?
I've tentatively got Pickens ranked higher.
Okay, because I think I want Marv.
Yeah, that's not unreasonable at all.
I think I want Harrison too, man. I wish I had more faith in what their plans for using him were going to be before I made that statement, but I think I would have Harrison there.
I have a feeling that's going to come up in our NFC West show.
Yeah. Maybe.
If you guys want a chance to win a signed TJ Hawkinson Vikings helmet for free, courtesy of our friends at pristineauction.com, all you need to do is head to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X/Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok at Fantasy Pros on all of those platforms. The more actions you complete, the more entries you receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes are up and to claim your prize. D-Bro, we're on to the Cincinnati Bengals. 9-8, did not sneak into the playoffs thanks to their slow start to the season. What is your fantasy takeaway for Cincy?
I think when we're in draft season and I think people are on the clock, they are very hesitant to make 2 draft picks and invest heavily in an offense in the sense of taking 2 wide receivers from the same offense. I think that we need to get past this. I've stated this before, but I think that what we saw from the Bengals, if we think an offense is going to pass a lot, which Cincinnati did, and there's other offenses that we can say that for looking into 2025, I have no issues, and I don't think anybody should have any issues taking 2 wide receivers from the same team in fantasy in draft season. You look at what Chase and T. Higgins did this year, wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game. And that's it. That's the stat.
What do you think about this, Fitz? Is this an example of the takeaway should be you can be comfortable when they're quality players taking 2 receivers from the same offense? Or is this an example of the outlier, the exception kind of defining the rule where, like, yes, it is an exception to the rule where you can take T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, but you shouldn't apply that to other receiving cores?
Debra, I'm sorry, but I think this is a freakish 1/10 of 1 percentile exception to the rule. Okay. Maybe 1/100th of 1 percentile. Like, I mean, I know I would get starting start sit questions in Discord where some guy would lay out his wide receiver core for me, and he would have like DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba. And my response was, part of it would be, you should probably trade one of those guys. Like, I just don't think it limits your weekly upside if you start two receivers from the same team, unless you've got a quarterback who's averaging like 340 passing yards and 3.5 touchdowns a game like Joe Burrow was. But how rare is that? So I think it can happen under the right circumstances, but in general practice, is it a good rule of thumb to draft two guys from the same team? I don't think it is.
No, I don't think in general practice there are reasons, and I envelope this in a team that is going to throw the ball and has good enough quarterback play to support two different guys, because two other instances that I will bring up right now: A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, wide receiver 12 and wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game. The Minnesota Vikings, Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 3, and Jordan Addison, wide receiver 21. Those are two other teams that we can point to that also fielded. These are three teams, 6 players that make up the top 24 wide receivers in fantasy.
But we also weren't getting smash games from Jefferson and Addison in the same week very often. We definitely weren't getting smash games from A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith.
No, but it evens out, right?
Very often. It does.
I mean, that's wide receiver in a nutshell, though. The volatility in the weekly roller coaster. No guy is top 5 every single week, regardless even if we rank him as top 5 every week.
Yeah, but if you're getting 18 PPR points from one guy and like 9 PPR from the other guy in any given week, like, I don't know if that's a win necessarily. Like, I just want to aim higher every week. And, then there are weeks like, what happens if the starting quarterback for that team gets garbage canned and all of a sudden the backup's in and now you're really hosed. So I think it's there's not enough upside and a little bit of volatility involved with that approach too. So I generally just don't think it's good strategy.
Do you guys see a difference in this strategy when they're both receivers versus drafting one receiver and a high-level tight end from the same team? Like, for example, are you going to be willing to draft Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride to the same fantasy team next year? Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers, whatever combo you want, Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews, Debro, is that something you're willing to do?
Same conversation.
Do you view that differently than two receivers?
Same conversation. I'm fine with it. Like, I mean, I think it's a great point that you brought up there, Worm, because tight ends, the top end guys, we should view as wide receivers, not tight ends, because they produce like wide receivers. The cross correlation between positional stuff. So, would we have had any problems drafting Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride on the same team? No. Do we have any problems drafting Xavier Worthy and Travis Kelce, or Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce on the same team? No. So I think this all comes back to really just a point that I think that the bigger point here for me is I want to invest in good offenses, but offenses that are going to throw the ball a crap ton with good players in it. So,
Fitz, what do you think about that framing of a receiver and a tight end on the same team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay if you have situations like Bowers and Myers or like McBride and Harrison where it's two guys commanding a massive share of the targets on a particular team. Is it something I'm aiming to do, though? Definitely not.
Let's wrap up the AFC North with the Cleveland Browns. They were terrible, 3-14. I'm not even sure like how strong of a takeaway you can even have on the Browns, just given like what we saw from the quarterback position this year, the uncertainty of what we're going to see next year. Like, obviously they're somewhat beholden to Deshaun Watson financially, but they're already talking about how his Achilles, might not be ready for the start of the 2025 season. So like, Fitz, when you sit down to say, how do I even like come up with a takeaway for this Cleveland team and this Cleveland season? Like, how did you approach coming up with one?
Well, I think we've got to tie it into Deshaun Watson. And in this case, like the guy to have in the Cleveland offense, obviously, this year was Jerry Jeudy. And my take is that Jerry Jeudy's 2024 breakthrough is legit, and I am not going to fade him in 2025, even if the Browns say they're going to start Deshaun Watson as soon as he's ready. So Jeudy finished with 90 catches and 1,200 yards, but let's parse this a little more carefully. 7 starts for Deshaun Watson at the beginning of the season. In those games, Jeudy averaged 3 catches and 38 receiving yards. So then we got 7 starts out of Jameis Winston. Jeudy averaged 7 catches and 112.3 receiving yards in those games. And then even down the stretch, when we got 3 starts combined out of Dorian Thompson-Robinson and Bailey Zappi, Jeudy averaged 6.7 catches and 59 yards in those games. Like, he was still a legitimate fantasy starter, even with those backup, like, third string quarterbacks playing. So, I mean, like, Jeudy did significantly better with Bailey Zappi and Dorian Thompson-Robinson throwing him the ball than he did with Deshaun Watson. The question is whether Judy's slow start, I guess, with Watson was just fully attributable to how bad Deshaun was, or is it that, like, the light hadn't fully switched on for Jeudy? Because his career in general got off to a pretty slow start. I mean, he had a pretty promising rookie year, but then 3 very disappointing seasons in Denver. So I don't know, maybe Jeudy is going to fare much better next season, even if it is Deshaun Watson at quarterback. But here's the thing, like, the Browns are not going to let Watson make 7 more starts next season if he plays as poorly as he did in 2024. They are just not going to give him that much leash. So I have Jeudy ranked wide receiver 22, right behind Zay Flowers. I suspect that's going to put me a little ahead of consensus on him. Maybe not. But yeah, I want to be invested in this guy after his thoroughly impressive season this year, because he was just lights out. I think he's one of the 10 best route runners in the game.
Where do you expect him, Fitz, to be ranked in ECR next year? Not where you will have him, but where do you think he'll be?
I think around 25.
Yeah.
D-Bro, what do you think about Jerry Jeudy as somebody to not fade, even with the quarterback stuff going on?
I think you're not going to fade Jerry Jeudy because I think we're going to have a different quarterback. I mean, welcome Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders to Cleveland. They got the 2nd overall pick in the NFL draft. Even having them move up to number 1 with changing hands with Tennessee, if Tennessee, doesn't like however they want to approach this draft, tell them what they do at quarterback. They sign Sam Darnold, something like that, then they don't have a quarterback issue. Look, you want to go out and get Travis Hunter, you want to pair him with L'Jarius Sneed, by all means, go do it. But this all comes down to me, the way that you mitigate the Deshaun Watson stuff. You say, Deshaun, stay home. We're going to obviously have to pay you. We're going to cut you. We're going to do something else. This team is ready to go, man. Like, you look at the defense, if they can get health out of them, you look at the offensive line, you look at the skill players. You draft a running back in the middle rounds. You go draft your quarterback with the number 2 overall pick. Maybe you move up to 1. And you roll into 2025, and we're all happy about Jerry Jeudy because it's not freaking Deshaun Watson throwing the football to him.
We'll wrap up the AFC North there. Please be sure to check out all of our division fantasy takeaways. We're doing every single division as their own little smaller episode. For D-Bro and Fitz, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.